So we've talked about the differential power that employers and employees have in labour markets, and we've talked about the underlying advantage that certain product market situations might provide for one organisation or another to be able to provide the sort of rewards that are attractive to get the kind of stuff that they want. We haven't yet talked in any detail about how this actually helps us to make decisions about setting appropriate rates of pay, or about identifying what a competitive reward might look like. Now, we'll go on to talk about this in some further detail, but we're going to just stop here and start to think about how we make sense of what's going on within labour markets, about how we think about labour markets beyond these broad issues of general advantage or general disadvantage to one side or another in certain situations at certain points in time. Now, in some ways, the operation of labour markets is just like any other market. As we've mentioned, we have buyers, employers, and we have sellers, employees, that they buy and sell. And just like any other market, the role of the market is to provide a venue, a situation in which buyers and sellers can come together and agree on a price for the commodity in question. So here we're looking at the opportunity for employers and employees to get together and to identify what an appropriate price for their particular type of labour might be at a particular point in time. Now that sounds, it sounds fine. It sounds very sterile. It sounds very little like what actually happens in practice, because we're abstracting. We're using economic abstractions to make sense of the dynamics of 1,000, 1 million interactions that actually take place in the real world. And we're attempting to make sense of all of those differences by abstracting down to their bare essentials. And in its bare essentials, what we're looking at is a situation where we make certain assumptions, where employers are trying to reach decisions, to make choices about how much they're willing to spend in the labour market in a way which allows them to maximise profits. We're also dealing with an abstraction of what is an employer and what is an employee in this situation. Now, we know that employers, there are fewer of them than there are employees, and so maybe we can make a few more tangible assumptions about them than we would for employees. But employees, there are millions of them, tens, hundreds of millions, and they're not all the same. Now, this analysis of labour markets, where we're reducing everything to supply and demand, really doesn't provide any kind of understanding of the individual differences between employees. That some might be better, some might be more attractive than others. That all employees are not created equal. But for the purposes of trying to make sense of labour markets across the board, we're going to treat them as homogenous and interchangeable, that individuality isn't an issue. We're also working on the assumption that organisations will seek to try and pay the market rate, that they seek to be competitive, that markets are scenarios in which the level of competitiveness is established, that there is nothing to be gained for an employer, for example, to pay above or below the market rate. And we know, obviously, that those things are incorrect in practice. But at this level of abstraction, what we're simply trying to understand is how do the supply and demand of labour alter the prices that are being set. And so we look at those supply and demand curves. So if in a particular labour market, demand for a particular type of labour is very strong and supply of it is very constrained, then that will tend to push up the rate for that particular kind of work in that labour market, because there are many employers who want to get hold of those kinds of employees. There aren't that many of them, and so they're in a position where they can push up the price of their own labour. The labour market is very tight. As demand decreases, there are fewer employers who want that particular type of labour, or in a situation where the supply of that labour becomes more plentiful, say if those skills become more common in the labour market, then the situation starts to change, the dynamics change, that the price that any particular kind of employee can charge for that particular product, their commodity, their labour, the thing that they have, the value of it, the implicit value of it tends to get smaller as well. So we start to make, we can plot the supply and demand curves. We can think about how different employers are willing to pay at different rates, that different employees are willing to sell at different rates, and where those supply and demand curves overlap, we can hit the kind of market clearing rate, the point at which buyers in the whole and sellers in the whole are agreeing around a broadly acceptable rate for labour, and that is the market rate in that labour market for that particular kind of work. Now, that kind of labour market analysis is part and parcel of reward design, of understanding the dynamics of the marketplace, of understanding what the rates of pay might be for a particular kind of job. Now, as I said, this is all at a relatively high level of abstraction, so we need to start to add back in some of the reality of life, that the things that might be missed in those big macro analyses of what's going on. And so it may be that we need to look under the surface of that and think that, well, there will be certain situations where whatever the market rate is telling us, that it doesn't really provide us with sufficient understanding of what happens in a particular situation. So, for example, if an organisation is operating in a labour market where there are very low levels of unemployment, then the market rate might be clearly established. This is the rate of pay that is going for a certain kind of work. But simply paying that amount, or even a little bit higher, won't necessarily provide you with access to the kind of employees or the numbers of employees that you want, because there's a friction involved. If everybody who wants work already has work, you are faced with a situation of having to winkle people out of their existing jobs, and they often don't want to do that. If everybody's broadly happy with what they're doing, they don't have a good reason to change their work, then getting access to those people in a very tight labour market might actually require organisations to make a step change in terms of the amount that they're willing to pay. So those kinds of economic situations change the rule of the game, that the market changes qualitatively. It's not just a question of saying, I know what people are getting paid for this kind of work in this kind of market, and so if I meet that or I pay a little bit more, then I shall have access to a good selection of candidates for my organisation. May simply not be the case, because in those situations, labour market friction starts to come into play. People don't want to change their job. They don't want necessarily to leave. Similar situations occur where employers are very, very dominant in their labour market, and we've discussed previously about how this can allow organisations to set the terms of the labour market to their own advantage. And so that's very good from an employer's point of view, but it can also be a bit of a double-edged sword, because again, if an organisation has already effectively sucked up all of the local labour that's available, they're the big local employer, and they still need more, then they have to start looking further afield. And when they start looking further afield, it may be that it's not simply knowing what the local existing labour market rates might be. It's not even knowing what the relevant labour markets in the areas where they're seeking to recruit from might be, because they also have to take into consideration that they are recruiting from far afield. They're expecting people to uproot their lives and come and work somewhere else. And so again, being very dominant in a local labour market, sucking up all that labour, provides some advantages in terms of running the market, but if you require more, then you may need to make a step change in the amounts that you're making available in order to recruit from a wider geographical area. And the common issue affecting all of these concerns is that knowing what the market rate might be theoretically allows organisations to take a competitive stance, that they think that they might be able to recruit either a little bit below market and try and operate a leaner policy, a lower cost reward strategy, or maybe they think, well, if I go a little bit above market rate, then that provides me with access to the best employees. But obviously, an employer is not simply able to work independently. The market moves, the market has dynamism, so that if one employer moves in one direction or another, other competitors might follow suit, and the whole market tends to shift. So the thing tends to be a movable feast, and organisations need to be aware when they're thinking about their orientation to the labour market, firstly, that it's not simply a question of taking a snapshot of the market, then stepping away and saying, now I know what we're dealing with, the thing shifts, but also that whatever decisions they might make within the labour market alters the market as well, and that people will respond to those changes, to those decisions that you might make, and your competitors will always be looking. Other reasons for avoiding over-reliance on the market rate is that sometimes we need to take into account very individual situations. So compensating differentials approach, which sounds like a crazy name for something, but what this particular theory is talking about is that sometimes it's not easy to encapsulate the nature of a particular job or all of the features of a particular job in terms of our market analysis, and that some jobs need to have a little bit extra reward in order to compensate for something particular about that work. It might be that the work is particularly unpleasant, that we can understand the skills that are required, the qualifications, the type of people who might do it, and make some judgment about who we're looking for and what we might have to pay for those kind of people. But then there's something about the situation that we need to compensate for. It might be very difficult. It might be very unpleasant. It might be insecure. And so in order to compensate for those particular features, we might have to work around the market rate, to think beyond the market rate rather than simply taking it as read. Sometimes organisations take a particular judgment about being more generous than the market, not because they simply want to have access to better staff, but because they think that in the long run it will pay off for the organisation. So efficiency wage theory talks about some of these instances where organisations that are more generous, that pay at the top end of the market, who aren't just seeking to optimise on the market rate, that they gain certain advantages from doing so, that they have lower labour turnover problems, and so they're not having to go to market so often, that they have more longevity in the people who come and work for them, more committed employees, better performing employees, employees who require less supervision. And so these individual circumstances or individual strategic decisions that organisations might make use of point to some of the limitations in understanding what the labour market rate might be. And so we need to take a more sophisticated approach to some of these issues that might be implied from a straightforward economic analysis of supply and demand in labour markets.